Forget the Iron Maiden. The Sultan's worst chamber was the one you couldn't measure, a calculated acoustic trap. In the Kafes, the imperial prison for royal heirs, the walls were deliberately thin and porous, engineered so the confined prince could hear everything outside his chamber, the ultimate psychological weapon of constant, oppressive surveillance. Through analysis of surviving Ottoman architectural practices and the known use of non-soundproof materials, we find evidence of this compelling absence of auditory privacy designed to maximize paranoia. How does an empire, famed for its massive 5-meter-thick fortress walls and towering siege defenses, simultaneously employ structural weakness as a weapon of state terror? The grand facade of Topkapi Palace hides a pervasive pattern of historical erasure, confirming that the deaths of many, from concubines to high-profile political rivals, were strategically excluded from exact records to maintain imperial secrecy. This institutional silence permitted atrocities that went beyond psychological torment. We track the path of a foreign subject whose death was officially deemed natural, only for international pressure to force a rare, horrifying event, the first documented joint autopsy performed on a palace victim, compelling the empire to prove it hadn't covered up a political murder. What other calculated cruelties lurked in the imperial blind spot? Step inside the calculated geometry of absolute power and discover the terrifying methods hidden by imperial law. Our journey into this historical darkness does not begin in the Sultan's court, but in the muddy fields of a long-forgotten battlefield, where modern science has finally forced the truth from the very earth that covered it. We begin not in a chamber of state, but in a grave in Sultan, Croatia, a place where a Turkish Ikinci light cavalry raid swept through in 1441, leaving behind a burial site that history had tried to forget. This is where the story shifts from mythology to measurable fact, from rumor to forensic report. For centuries, the violence of this raid was a simple historical footnote, an event swallowed by the sheer scale of the Ottoman advance. But modern osteological analysis, using the latest techniques of forensic archaeology, has scraped away the soil and revealed the cold, hard number exposed by science. A total of 82 perimortem injuries were recorded across just 22 victims exhumed from that site. This is the quantified legacy of the Sultan's terror, a finding that moves beyond simple historical description to deliver a scientific verdict. The trauma analysis, the mapping of blunt force, sharp force, and penetrating wounds, allows us to witness the true physical extent of the atrocity. When you look at the skeleton, you are looking at a medical report written in bone, a document of sustained suffering that the official chronicles deliberately avoided composing. Now, we must understand the why of these injuries, moving from the statistical overview to the individual subject, preparing to face the truly horrifying conclusion of what this level of violence represented. Because the most disturbing number in that grave relates to a single victim, a young woman whose trauma profile defies every definition of conventional warfare. And that is a revelation we must approach with caution. That statistical legacy, the sheer number of documented injuries we just uncovered, is horrific enough, but the true terror of this particular site is revealed only when we analyze who the violence targeted and how that violence was distributed. We noticed an immediate demographic profile in the Sultan raid victims. Young adults were singled out for attack, confirming the Ikinci's mandate was not merely battle, but terrorizing and scattering local populations before the regular army's advance, making this an act of political extermination rather than military conquest. These aren't the random casualties of a siege. This is personalized savagery designed to create a region of fear and silence. As forensic scientists mapped the trauma, a stunning and heartbreaking pattern emerged across the 22 individuals excavated. The analysis of perimortem trauma, injuries inflicted around the time of death, found stark and significant sex differences. Females in the group exhibited significantly more perimortem injuries per individual and per bone affected than their male counterparts. This is a crucial finding because it completely refutes the idea of random conflict. Instead, the analysis points directly toward a deliberate and concentrated focus on suffering. The morphology and pattern of trauma observed in the female victims was, by the expert consensus of the researchers, highly suggestive of gratuitous violence. This was violence that exceeded the requirements of killing. It was designed to maximize pain, to defile, and to send a message of absolute, unsparing power to those who survived and fled. It was a calculated strategy to spread panic in the area, part of a long-term plan intended to depopulate the region around Osijek as punishment or preemptive action. This leads us inevitably to the single most shocking piece of forensic evidence recovered from Siepen, the horrifying individual case that defines the extremity of this violence and provides the most visceral documentation of overkill found in the entire assemblage, a detail so extreme it must be handled with the utmost care, but which serves as undeniable proof of the capacity for calculated cruelty that flowed from the empire's policies. We have established that the violence carried out by the Akinji was calculated and that the gendered pattern of trauma reveals an intent of unparalleled, targeted ferocity. But now we must confront the final and most haunting piece of evidence from the Siepen grave, the single data point that converts historical tragedy into a forensic nightmare. You need to understand this detail not as sensationalism, but as the quantifiable truth of pure, unadulterated hatred, the scientific proof of sadism. Our focus tightens onto one individual, a young female victim estimated to be between 15 and 29 years old. Her postcranial skeleton telling a story of sustained, intimate destruction that defies the logic of battlefield killing. The meticulous medical examination, mapping every fracture, every incision, every sign of injury inflicted at or near the time of her death, led to a conclusion that stands as a stark monument to her suffering. The analysis revealed not just multiple wounds, not just fatal trauma, but a staggering 22 distinct perimortem injuries concentrated with surgical focus to one highly sensitive region of her body, the general pelvic area. Imagine the sound, the persistence, the relentless, minute-by-minute application of pain required to inflict 22 separate traumas, all localized to a specific zone using instruments ranging from sharp blades to blunt force objects. The forensic team's conclusion, based on the signature of these wounds, confirmed the use of at least 3 different types of weapon on this single victim, confirming the atrocity was not a momentary burst of rage, but a deliberate, protracted session of cruelty. When confronted with evidence like this, the scientific language of pathology struggles, and yet the experts found a fitting term for the sustained, agonizing brutality they uncovered. They called it clear evidence of overkill. This single victim, with her 22 localized wounds, is the documented, anatomical proof of the true, horrifying extent of the terror that Ottoman policy intended to spread across its frontiers. If this shocking depth of sadistic violence was unleashed without constraint by raiding parties on the distant borderlands, what kind of refined, psychological, and physical horror was being perfected and preserved in the silent, invisible heart of the empire? We must now shift our gaze from the verifiable physical trauma of the corpse to the calculated terror of the center, because the Sultan's most profound secret was not found in a distant field, but in the calculated geometry of his own private palace. The horror we have uncovered in the Siepen grave, with its quantified trauma and its story of overwhelming malice, forces a fundamental reassessment of Ottoman power, demanding we recognize that brutality was not always crude, but often meticulously planned. If such unrestrained sadism was standard practice on the distant periphery of the empire, what terrifying control mechanisms were enforced at its heart? We shift now from the blood-soaked earth of the frontier to the gilded cages of Istanbul, establishing the immense, magnificent, and utterly deceptive scale of the Ottoman political heart. This is Topkapi Palace, the Seraglio, a sprawling complex that commanded the fortunes of an empire, spanning an immense area of 59,260 to 70,000 square meters. a world unto itself, a physical embodiment of absolute sovereign authority. This colossal expanse, however, served as a brilliant, terrible architectural lie. For within its majestic walls, behind its pavilions, courtyards, and gardens, lay a hidden, terrible negation of that grandeur, the secret prison known as the Kafes, or the cage. The Kafes was not some medieval dungeon. It was the designated confinement area within the imperial harem, formally established after 1617 to sequester potential successors to the throne, brothers, cousins, and nephews, instead of executing them outright in the bloody practice of fratricide. This practice of confinement was sold to the world as an act of relative mercy, a civilized alternative to the execution of infants, but in truth it was a refined psychological terror. The horror was in the shocking contrast between the vastness of the palace, the very symbol of the wealth and power that the princes might inherit, and the minute, crushing isolation of the chambers themselves. But there is a terrifying detail about these specific confinement cells, a fact that speaks volumes about the true nature of their function and the state's calculated intent to hide its methods, a physical measurement that, paradoxically, we cannot give you because the precise geometry of terror was deliberately omitted from the official record, a critical void we must explore to understand the genius of the Sultan's design for psychological destruction. The horrifying data point of 22 concentrated injuries forces us to acknowledge that the calculated evil of the Ottoman regime was far more detailed than we imagined, but that horror took an entirely different, perhaps even more insidious form within the walls of the palace. We have established that the immense, magnificent expanse of Topkapi Palace, covering up to 70,000 square meters, was a monumental deception, concealing the true prison that was the Kafes, where the heirs to the empire were effectively sequestered. This move, in the 17th century, replaced wholesale fratricide with house arrest, but the state merely traded the swift brutality of the sword for the slow, crushing torment of the mind. The most terrifying genius of the Kafes system is defined not by the things we can touch and measure, but by what the architects meticulously refused to document. When Ottoman builders designed grand structures, mosques, baths, or even administrative buildings, their plans often survived, painstakingly drawn and employing precise techniques like checkered grids to denote the proportional systems and dimensions of the spaces within. But when you search the extensive imperial archives for the definitive, precise, physical measurements, the floor plans, or the cross-sections that would give you the cold, hard square footage of the individual confinement cells of the Kafes, they are simply absent. This is not accidental neglect. It is an active political strategy of intentional omission, a demonstration of power by refusal to quantify the prison itself. The political function of the Kafes was absolute isolation, and by maintaining this veil of secrecy over the architectural dimensions, the state ensured that the prison's physical limits remained intentionally unknowable. The confinement was less about the space's size and more about the crushing psychological effect of being perpetually under the sovereign's indefinite control. Trapped in an environment whose rules and boundaries were structurally fluid and ambiguous. This lack of verifiable physical data establishes a compelling pattern of concealment, reinforcing the pattern of imperial silence we noted earlier, where the deaths of concubines or harem staff were also excluded from exact records. If the state could make death invisible, it could certainly make confinement non-quantifiable, leading us to the next crucial detail: how the very materials of the prison walls were transformed from a boundary into a weapon of non-stop invasive surveillance. That terrifying reality, the missing measurements of the Kafes, proves the empire had refined its terror to a point where documentation became a liability, deliberately maintaining an architectural void at the very heart of the succession process. But even without thick walls or hidden dungeons, the prison structure was designed to attack the mind. The psychological mechanism of the Kafes exploited the most intimate environment of the palace: sound. Traditional Middle Eastern architecture, employing materials like wood and plaster, inherently meant that soundproofing was virtually non-existent in residential buildings. This material fragility, which defined the very structure of the confinement, meant that little auditory privacy existed for the imprisoned prince. The walls were physically separating the air from the outside world, yet they were acoustically transparent. The physical separation was entirely nullified by sound permeability. This turned the Kafes into a calculated, transparent acoustic cage. Every conversation carried by the guards outside, every whisper of palace staff, every muffled administrative order, and every conversation or cry from the bustling world of the court could potentially be overheard by the confined prince, creating an environment where every private expression, every movement, and every moment of despair was potentially monitored. Imagine the crushing mental load of perpetual intrusive surveillance, where the space designed to protect you from murder instead becomes an instrument for maximum paranoia. Trapped in gilded isolation, unable to verify the meaning or intent of the surrounding murmurs, the prince was intellectually and politically isolated, his mind corroding under the strain of constant auditory engagement with the power he was denied. This psychological destruction, this weaponization of sound and silence, stands in stark contrast to the overwhelming, physical, measurable terror deployed by the empire in its maximum security public prisons. Now we must leave the gilded but porous confinement of the Sultan's palace and enter the world's most infamous Ottoman jail, Yedikule Fortress, where the terror was not a psychological whisper, but a quantified, inescapable shout built from stone and fear, where we will encounter documented dimensions that shock the modern conscience. The sound-porous walls of the Kafes reveal the empire's mastery of psychological warfare, an invisible architecture of despair that attacked the minds of its sequestered princes through relentless, unceasing auditory surveillance, proving that some of the deepest cruelties are not delivered by the sword, but by intentional silence and forced listening. However, the Sultanate employed another, older, and far more physically overwhelming kind of prison, a monumental statement of power designed to crush resistance, not with whispers, but with quantifiable, unyielding force. And this is where we turn now, to Yedikule Fortress. This notorious maximum security state prison, whose name translates simply as the Castle of Seven Towers, was not merely a convenient holding cell, it was a structure specifically engineered for absolute containment. Mehmed the Conqueror, after taking Constantinople in 1453, demolished the Byzantine segment of the ancient Golden Gate and built 3 massive new Ottoman towers into the existing walls, transforming a triumphal arch into a terrifying citadel of incarceration. The fortress's very design confirmed its function as an unyielding confinement facility, a physical manifestation of imperial finality. Unlike the deliberately vague measurements of the Kafes, the dimensions of Yedikule are strikingly precise, giving us a terrifying quantified sense of the oppression faced by its prisoners. Look, for example, at one of the newly constructed Ottoman additions, Tower C, a 5-story round tower on the southeast corner. Its height, meticulously recorded in architectural surveys, stands at a formidable 25.84 meters high without its crowning platform. This sheer, quantifiable scale establishes the overwhelming physical reality of the prison, a structure engineered to swallow its occupants completely, from foreign diplomats to high-profile domestic enemies, ensuring neither escape nor rescue was possible. But these towers are only one part of the story, because the walls surrounding them, the thick carapace of stone that enclosed the suffering within, offer an even more shocking measure of the lengths the state went to ensure absolute control, details we must examine next. The 25-meter height of Tower C at Yedikule already quantified the crushing physical scope of this state prison, a structure built with an undeniable finality of purpose. But the real measure of the oppression isn't found just in the towers rising above the earth, but in the thickness of the stone that shut out hope. We invite you to picture this: stand at the base of the massive defensive curtain walls that connect the fortress's towers. How secure would you feel knowing the stone separating you from freedom was a towering, unrelenting mass? These formidable outer walls were not merely thick for defense. They were a quantifiable statement of the Sultan's unyielding will, measuring an average thickness of 4.90 to 500 meters. Picture 5 meters of solid, tightly packed masonry. You are looking at nearly 17 feet of stone designed not just to keep an army out, but to ensure that nothing, no message, no tool, no ray of hope, could ever breach its inner sanctum from the outside. That colossal barrier rose to a height of 1250 to 13.55 meters. The physical reality of Yedikule was not just overwhelming. It was engineered to prevent both escape and external intervention at all costs, establishing a physical standard of confinement that seems impossible but is meticulously documented in the architectural surveys. This quantified constraint was an instrument of psychological terror in itself, confirming that escape was a fantasy and that the world outside had entirely forgotten you. But the stone only tells half the story. The real horror of Yedikule, the part that transcended the physical dimensions, was the sensory atmosphere, the documented sights and sounds recorded by the prisoners themselves within the infamous dungeon tower. A dark reality we must now explore using a diplomat's chilling diary. The weight of stone at Yedikule, with its 5-meter thick walls and 25-meter high towers, provided a crushing, quantified physical certainty of confinement. But even within that overwhelming structure, the deepest chamber held horrors that transcended mere architecture. We must now step into the Tower of Inscriptions, explicitly known to its occupants as the Zindan Kulesi, the Dungeon Tower, which served as the epicenter of suffering for diplomats and high-profile prisoners. Abandon the sense of sight for a moment and let the sensory environment envelop you, because the physical walls of this tower were saturated with documented suffering. The name Tower of Inscriptions itself is primary evidence. Its walls are covered in names, dates, and desperate messages carved by the prisoners themselves, text in Latin, French, and Hungarian, physical proof of detention over centuries. Now listen to the testimony of French diplomat François Pouqueville, held captive here from 1799 to 1801, whose diary provides a chilling, visceral inventory of the dungeon's atmosphere. Pouqueville details the interior, describing it as choked with fetters, chains, and old-time weapons, graves, ruins. Then comes the horrifying sensory punch, a disturbing metaphor of bodily saturation. He wrote of wells of blood, terrible tortures, vaults cold and hollow. Whether interpreted literally as basins containing the remains of victims, or metaphorically as the stone floors being saturated with the blood of generations, the phrase wells of blood establishes a terrifying forensic marker of decay and persistent death within the structure. And the sounds, too, were instruments of torment. Pouqueville documented the disturbing, macabre mixing of noise that defined his imprisonment. Shrill cries of owls and vultures mixed with the sound of sea billows. This is not generic historical rhetoric. It is a meticulous sensory documentation of an environment where the natural world, the scavengers drawn by decay, and the relentless wash of the waves mingled with the sounds of human confinement, creating a persistent auditory anguish that maximized despair. This profound, documented sensory reality forces us to ask, if the psychological conditions of the Kafes were designed to slowly break the mind, what methods of deliberate, prolonged physical devastation were simultaneously being deployed by the state outside the palace? The answer leads us to the most notorious and medically complex forms of sanctioned state violence. The sounds of Yedikule's Zindan Kulesi, the macabre mixing of sea billows and the shrill cries of vultures over the prisoners' heads, proved that suffering was engineered into the very atmosphere. But if the state wished to make a truly public, truly horrifying statement, it turned to the most notorious of all its instruments of vengeance: impalement. This was not merely execution. It was a demonstration of mathematical cruelty designed to extend life and maximize the duration of public agony. Impalement, involving the penetration of the human body by a stake or pole, was a reserved punishment, deployed primarily for the gravest of offenses, the so-called crimes against the state, encompassing treason, military indiscipline, and rebellion. The key mechanism of its horror lay not in the immediate killing, but in the gruesome, almost surgical precision required to sustain life. Historical descriptions detail two main methods, but it was the longitudinal impalement that perfected the calculated slow death. This technique involved driving the stake carefully into the body, typically through the rectum or vagina, guiding it to follow the spine and emerge near the shoulder or neck. The design was not about efficiency, it was about protracted deterrence. The perpetrators took meticulous care to avoid vital organs, the heart, the major vessels, the lungs, so that the victims were not swiftly dispatched, but instead hung agonizingly in place for hours, even days. The goal was to maximize the duration of their public suffering, transforming the victims' final moments into a political spectacle of slow, excruciating death intended to etch the fear of the Sultan's justice onto the populace's mind. This refinement of lethal agony, however, coexisted with a method of non-lethal torture that was equally widespread and brutally effective in breaking the body without ending life, focusing on destroying a victim's ability to stand or flee, a method we must now examine to grasp the full spectrum of imperial violence. The horrifying precision of longitudinal impalement proved the state's capacity to transform execution into a protracted public torture, maximizing the spectacle of slow death by meticulously avoiding the victim's vital organs. But not every method of state violence was lethal. Many were designed merely to break the individual, ensuring compliance without generating a corpse, and for this the Ottomans perfected the ancient art of falaka. This form of torture, also widely known as bastinado, was ancient, traditional throughout the Middle East, and applied even for the punishment of children, making it a routine instrument of control across all levels of society. The mechanism is simple, yet brutally effective. The victim's ankles are held or tied up in the air, and the soles of the feet are repeatedly beaten with sticks or truncheons. It targets the most sensitive, vital points of locomotion. Medically, this method is devastating because the feet are highly vulnerable to blunt trauma, yet severe soft tissue damage, swelling, and internal bruising can be inflicted without leaving immediate, external, life-threatening marks that might draw unwanted attention or halt interrogation. The intentionality here is chilling. The torture compromised the victim's ability to walk, to run, and to flee, reducing them to a state of complete, crippled dependence. It was the perfect tool for sustained, non-lethal interrogation and punishment, inflicting extreme pain and mobility compromise while keeping the subject alive for subsequent questioning or display. This pervasive, almost routine application of non-lethal torture highlights a crucial principle of imperial control. The methods of cruelty were tailored precisely to the target, whether it was the total psychological ruin sought in the Kafes, the permanent physical deterrence of impalement, or the sheer crippling pain inflicted by the bastinado. But even with these horrific tools, the state frequently found itself caught in a lie, an official narrative that desperately sought to conceal murder, leading us to the most critical forensic and diplomatic contradiction of the 19th century, where the Ottoman government was forced to exhume a body and let its lies collapse under the glare of scientific scrutiny. The implementation of falaka demonstrated a calculated effort to inflict crippling, non-lethal pain, perfecting the art of breaking a prisoner without creating a politically inconvenient corpse. But this refinement of non-lethal torture highlights a far greater horror: the institutionalized lie that supported it. But it gets worse. Far worse, because the state's cruelty was often supported by a deliberate, elaborate policy of concealment, an institutionalized policy of cover-up designed to render certain acts of violence historically invisible. Official court histories and palace records reveal a pervasive pattern of erasure. The deaths of less prominent residents, such as concubines or harem staff, were routinely excluded from exact records and often simply vanished without a formal death register entry. Imagine the cold calculation. If the administration maintained a functional mechanism for making staff disappear into bureaucratic oblivion, any violence, any murder, any undocumented execution occurring within the innermost walls of the palace could be absorbed into this institutional silence. This lack of verifiable documentation establishes a clear organizational strategy where the governing body had the power and the precedent to conduct violent acts without leaving a single trace in the official annals, ensuring that the dark deeds done inside the walls remained the Sultan's private secret. This pattern of omission created a massive, official contradiction between the reality of state violence and the historical fiction presented to the public and the diplomatic corps. This lie was maintained for generations until one specific incident of murder and religious pressure collided violently with the rising power of European diplomacy, forcing the Ottoman state to allow an unprecedented, horrifying intervention that shattered the official narrative and for the first time used objective science to verify a politically motivated assassination. A dramatic climax we must now prepare to witness. The official administrative silence around deaths in the palace created a dangerous organizational void, a pattern of concealment that allowed acts of violence to disappear without a trace in the imperial records, a policy that held for centuries until it collided with the growing scrutiny of European diplomacy, leading to the ultimate contradiction in 1852. Now, we approach the terrifying climax of this administrative cover-up. The setting is Yanya, known today as Ioannina, where a high-ranking Ottoman official reported that his servant had died naturally soon after voluntarily converting to Islam, a seemingly mundane event, but one that contained a fatal flaw. The Austrian embassy immediately intervened, asserting with documented conviction that the deceased was, in fact, an Austrian subject, and that his death had been anything but natural. They claimed the servant had been beaten to death while being forcibly pressed to accept Islam, and furthermore, no Austrian official had been present to verify the legitimacy of the conversion. The lie was exposed, triggering a major diplomatic crisis. The Ottoman state, now facing the combined force of international indignation and the need to refute a charge of politically motivated murder, was compelled to take a radical and unprecedented step, an abandonment of their cherished narrative of internal sovereignty in favor of objective, scientific verification. The state was forced to agree to the exhumation of the body and the subsequent performance of an autopsy by a joint team of doctors, half from the Ottoman administration and half from the Austrian side. This event, recorded in diplomatic reports, is a critical historical marker, a horrifying triumph of forensic truth. The state's necessity to participate in a joint exhumation and autopsy provides documented, undeniable proof of its attempt to conceal a political murder and the eventual diplomatic pressure required to shatter the institutional lie. This rare, documented instance where objective medical science was introduced to challenge the court's fabricated history confirms that the truth of the Sultan's brutality could only emerge when external forces demanded the corpse be allowed to speak. And yet, the regime's cruelty extended beyond even this forced act of scientific verification, culminating in an act of theatrical violence that was designed purely to insult and provoke its critics, a final, grotesque statement of imperial scorn we must now detail. The successful forced autopsy in Yanya was a critical turning point, a rare moment where diplomatic pressure compelled the Ottoman state to abandon its organizational lie in favor of forensic fact. But the state's reaction to external criticism often reverted to raw, theatrical cruelty. The regime understood that symbolic violence, the visible desecration of a dead body, could be as powerful a tool of control as a hidden execution, designed specifically to insult the rising power of the West. Consider the case of a man named Avakim, whose execution was politically charged. After his death, his mutilated remains were retrieved by officials who then engaged in a grotesque act of post-mortem mockery. The body was deliberately and meticulously clothed in European costume, and the head carefully covered with a European hat. This was not an oversight, as Ottoman diplomats later weakly claimed, describing the clothing affair as a mistake, but a calculated, deliberate provocation. The intent was clear: to take a life and then use the subsequent display of the corpse to launch a specific political insult. The act was deemed a particular insult by the Western press and the diplomatic corps, who correctly interpreted the dressing of the remains as a gesture of profound scorn directed at European standards, demonstrating that the empire's cruelty was not purely punitive but contained a sophisticated theatrical component aimed at maximizing political outrage. This fusion of violence and calculated theatricality reveals the depth of the regime's cynicism, using the dead body as a political prop to both terrorize its subjects and mock its foreign rivals. This is the calculated geometry of power, a structure where the line between bureaucratic process, psychological torment, and raw theatrical sadism was not just blurred, but actively weaponized. But even as we detail these horrors, an unexpected piece of primary source evidence, an absurd contradiction involving the sense of smell, provides a momentary, bizarre glimpse into the fragility of the Ottoman judicial process, suggesting that even at the threshold of death, a strange appeal to the sensory world could, on rare occasions, overturn the machinery of state execution, a baffling detail we must address next.